Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Desert Beavers, Saving Water on the Colorado Plateau, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Aaron Bott. Due to his remote location, Aaron's limited internet bandwidth may not allow him to share his webcam with our audience today. While you may not be able to see Aaron during some of the webinar, you'll still be able to hear him speaking throughout the entire presentation. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Aaron. I'll hand things off to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Everyone, I'm excited to be talking about beavers on the Colorado Plateau. This is a subject that I'm very interested in. I'm also very involved in restoring beavers to areas of the Colorado Plateau where they're much needed or where they've historically ranged but have been extirpated. This is a great story. I think it's very poignant today, as at least here in the American West, we're suffering from a major drought. And that's kind of what inspired me to talk about beavers in North America, specifically on the Colorado Plateau. Hopefully all of you can hear me. I wish we could be doing this face to face. I really enjoy interacting with an audience and having questions flow and answers flow back and forth. Hopefully I'll leave some time at the end so that we'll be able to chit chat a little bit if you do have any specific questions. But again, welcome. Today we are going to be talking about desert beavers, saving water on the Colorado Plateau. Really quick, an introduction about myself. I am a wildlife biologist. I have lived in the Intermountain American West for my entire life. In fact, my family has lived out here for 6 generations. This is a picture of myself, my wife, and my boy, who's now 2 years old. And that in my arms is not my dog. It's actually a beaver, in case you couldn't tell. As a wildlife biologist, I get to work with many different species native to North America, everything from beavers to grizzly bears to wolves to mountain goats to bighorn sheep to elk, etc. It's a pretty exciting job. I work with government, federal, and state, and I'm currently working on a PhD researching wolves up in Yellowstone National Park. Large carnivores are my specialty. Nevertheless, again, I'm excited to be talking about beavers and what they mean to us out here on the Colorado Plateau. Today, I'm actually talking to you all from southeastern Utah, a region where we are currently working on beaver habitat restoration. The layout of my topic today is going to pretty much go as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about the natural history of the animal. Beavers are very cool, semi-aquatic, large rodents. And I think that's what is so attractive to me about beavers in the desert. It seems like it's a paradox, because usually when we see beavers, when we think of beavers, we think of these big, lush ponds, kind of moose habitat, if you will, high up in the mountains or along rich riparian areas. But beavers do actually live in the desert. And if you have had the opportunity to participate in Natural Habitat Adventures canyons trips, it's possible that you've seen at least beaver sign, perhaps along the Virgin River in Zion National Park. We have beavers all throughout the Southwest. Of course, the habitat is limiting, so they're not quite as abundant as they would be in more wet and vegetated areas. Nevertheless, we do have these animals, and their historic range pretty much covered everything in North America, from the high tundra up in Alaska, up in Canada, from coast to coast, and to some degree all the way down through Mexico. There are 2 species of beaver in the world. Castor canadensis is the species native to North America, but there's also Castor fibrus, which is the Eurasian beaver. Pretty much they look the same. You have to really get into the nitty-gritty, into the genotypes in order to identify which species is which. But these animals are, again, large rodents. In fact, they're the largest North American rodent, and they can weigh between 30 to 60 pounds, even a little bit heavier. Most of the beavers that we capture and handle are usually 40, 50 pounds, 60 pounds occasionally. And that, I think, surprises a lot of people. They don't realize that a beaver is essentially the same size as your golden retriever. They are big animals and they're heavy animals. As rodents, they're pretty fecund. They have the ability to reproduce successfully and to rear their young with less mortality rates in their offspring, kits as they're called, than other rodents that we're familiar with. They reproduce annually, so one time a year they go through an estrus cycle. It's usually in the winter, just depending on the latitude of the beaver population. And then they will reproduce usually in the spring or late spring is what we see around here in Utah. Typically, you have an average of 2 to 4 kits born every year, but the numbers can range from 1 to as many as 9 kits. Again, it's pretty remarkable to see this large rodent in rearing its offspring. In ecology, we have what's known as a K versus R selection theory or reproductive theory. Basically, that is a scale on which we can measure how organisms reproduce and their fecundity, which is the rate of survival in their offspring. So humans would be on the extreme end of the K selection, meaning we have offspring relatively slowly. It takes us a long time to reach sexual maturity compared to other animals. And when we do give birth, it's generally 1, occasionally 2 or 3 children that we then have to spend years raising until they're fully mature and capable of surviving on their own. On the opposite side of that spectrum, you can have things like rabbits or frogs would even be a better example, where they have lots and lots of offspring or lay lots of eggs, and basically there's no parental investment in helping those offspring reach maturity. They're kind of ready to go right off the bat. Beavers, again, being a rodent, are a little bit unique when compared to other rodents because they actually do spend a lot of time raising their kits. They make sure that they can reach maturity and be fully independent before those kits leave their colony. That's what you call a group of beavers, a colony. Although some biologists kind of don't like using that term because it's a little bit misleading. When we think of a colony, probably a prime example would be like a prairie dog colony, where you have really a large community of related and sometimes not related individuals of the same species living together, interacting together. Beavers are almost more, and I'm going to go out on a limb here as a wolf biologist and say that they're more like wolves than they live in packs, or like humans live in family groups. So beavers are monogamous, promiscuous monogamous, as most monogamous animals are. You'll generally have an adult breeding pair that mates for life. If one of the individuals dies, they'll go off and they can find another mate. And their colony, their family group, basically is comprised of several years or generations of offspring. So typically in a colony, you have a breeding male and a breeding female living together with the young of the year. So that might be, again, 2 to 4 kits. The young of the year are those kits, those offspring that were born that year, that spring. And you also generally have yearlings, so the older generation of kids or kits living together as a family unit. So in a single colony, you can have anything from 4 to 6 to even maybe 12 beavers all living and working together. Eventually, as the kits get old enough, they want to disperse. They want to find habitat for themselves, very similar to how our offspring eventually become independent. The benefits of finding a mate outweigh any benefits that come from living with mom and dad. And so they'll move off onto their own and make themselves comfortable in their natural world, usually moving just downstream or upstream of their parents. And that way, beavers can actually recolonize wetland areas relatively quickly. pretty much every year you're going to have some of your offspring moving off and settling new parts, new habitat. Beavers are very anatomically interesting, and they're very adept for what they specialize in. I think all of us are pretty well aware that beavers like to eat wood. They like to chew on trees, soft deciduous plants. Woody vegetation is their favorite kind of food. They have these incredible adaptive incisors that have an iron enameled coating. That's what makes them orange there. And they continue to grow and become hardened, and they're chisel-like, and they're great for chewing through trees. And basically, they're knocking down trees in order to get to food. They'll also eat grasses, forbs, herbaceous plants, but primarily what they like to go for is soft woody vegetation, which is rich in cellulose. So those sugars that can then be converted as carbohydrates into nitrogen, which is a building block for proteins. It helps the animal grow and get fat. Interestingly enough, though, beavers are monogastric, so they have a digestive system that is more closely related to us humans, you could say, although it is different, but more closely related to us humans than a ruminant, an animal with a four-chambered stomach. They also have these incredible molars you can see on the back here. They're hypsodont teeth, which means that the wear and tear of these molars does not necessarily break down as they continue to chew on these woody vegetative plants. The skulls of these animals are very robust because it takes a lot of muscle to chew through the bark to fell these big trees down. Ultimately, what they're going for is cambium, which is this. It's the live part of the tree or the live part of the branch in some cases. They're trying to get to that because that is what contains all of the fresh nutrients. So it's not the woody core or the dead wood inside of the tree, but it's the bark and that fresh living layer known as the cambium just underneath the bark. It's paper thin, but that's why it's common when you see beaver chewed sticks or beaver chewed logs to find everything stripped off and they just leave the stick or the hardened wood, the dead wood itself behind. Then they'll take often that dead wood or even branches and sometimes trees and put them together in order to make themselves lodges or dams. Those are kind of the two popular structures that we most associate beavers with. These big lodges are primarily the homes made in defense from predators that these beavers will live together in colonies. And if they're not building lodges, then they're constructing dams. Dams are made to prevent water from running away, and it also increases security for the beaver's habitat. So if the water is running, then the beaver has a natural instinct, if they hear running water, to go and try and clog whatever leak there is. And in doing so, they're increasing their protection. They're increasing the security of their habitat. Beavers are very awkward on land, and if on land, they quickly become prey to lots of different carnivores. Wolves are the #1 carnivore for beavers wherever their ranges overlap. In fact, I just got back from doing research in Yellowstone where I found 2 beavers that had recently been consumed by wolves. Again, they just wait for the beavers to come up on land, and then they pounce on them and scarf them up. Mountain lions are a popular predator of beavers down here in Utah, as well as coyotes and black bears. But even river otters and lynx, they also often consume beavers. So in order to help themselves stay away from these predators, in order to ensure the protection of their offspring and their own protection, beavers like to build these big dams to raise the water levels where coincidentally it irrigates the plants that they need in order to survive and to consume, but it also provides habitat where they can live safely and pretty much without any fear. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the beaver digestive system is pretty fantastic. They have basically what's known as a hindgut fermenter. So it's this unusual cardiogastric gland that ferments cellulose and feeds microbes within their cecum, and then provides them ultimately nutrients. Beavers, as far as sexing them goes and determining whether they're male or female, have a cloaca, which is an opening for their reproductive and digestive tract. This is a picture I took of us sexing a beaver to determine whether it was male or female. So when we are trying to document what species we are reintroducing into certain areas, we squeeze this cloaca, and it's very invasive, I'm sorry to say, but we squeeze the cloaca and out pop these two anal glands that we see here. And interestingly enough, if you want to know if it's male or female, you have to milk these anal glands to get a secretion. And you can best tell if it's male if the secretion from the anal gland smells like diesel fuel, and if it's a female, it generally smells like strong cheese. That's a very graphic description, but if you're not doing that, then it's pretty difficult to determine the sex of the beaver. The males do have baculums, but again, they're internal, so it's difficult to know which sex you're dealing with unless you utilize this procedure to try and figure it out. Males and females do have some sexual dimorphisms. The males are generally larger, but still, if you want to make sure, then you have to check out their cloaca. I think we're all familiar with the wonders that beavers can do as environmental engineers. I know that NatHab has presented webinars on beavers before, and so I don't want to be too redundant, but beavers are a keystone species. There's not a lot of species that actually appropriately hold that title. Sometimes we, in popular literature, in society, we like to throw around keystone species a little bit loosely, but ultimately what a keystone species is an animal or an organism that basically holds everything together. If you remove it from an environment, the entire environment changes, often for the worse. So beavers once ranged across North America in the hundreds of millions. Some estimates go as high as 400 million beavers in all of North America prior to Euro-American settlement. The number, nevertheless, even if we're not sure about that high estimate, still was certainly in the hundreds of millions. They were very abundant, and because they were so abundant and living in every waterway, every stream from north to south, from east to west, they definitely impacted the environment of the landscape. And in this way, they caused, they prevented a lot of drought in some areas. Basically, they turned the landscape into like a sponge. So by holding or retaining water and retaining sediment, the earth was allowed to soak up water, which then provided, of course, resources for vegetation and then for other wildlife. And without beavers on the landscape, a lot of water just drains away, it goes downstream, and it takes a lot of rich sediment with it. So beavers are, aside from humans, the most impactful species in terms of engineering landscapes and habitats. They are very fascinating creatures for that. As I just mentioned, historically, beavers numbered in the hundreds of millions and ranged across most landscapes in North America. There were some places where they didn't historically live. Mostly some of those areas that come to mind were in the great deserts of the United States, the Great Basin, the Mojave. There were areas where there just wasn't sufficient water or habitat for these beavers to live. And historically, they've also never really established numerous colonies in Florida because you have alligators there, which prey on beavers whenever they get the chance to. I'm going to talk now, just by switching pace, about some of the human history of beavers, and specifically the human history on the Colorado Plateau. I think most of us are familiar with where the Colorado Plateau is, but if you're not familiar with it, you can take this satellite image and you can see those crosshairs, which actually makes up the four corners of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And this central region that we have pretty much encompasses what is known geographically and topographically as the Colorado Plateau. So it's this high elevation desert where the elevation ranges from about 4,000 feet above sea level to as much as 12,000 feet above sea level. If you've been to the canyons of Utah, Arizona, if you've been to the Southwest at all, generally you're typically thinking about the Colorado Plateau. So if you've been to Grand Canyon National Park, if you've been to Zion National Park, Arches National Park, all of the Utah national parks, Bryce Canyon, all of these areas are unique because of the topography and the geography of the landscape. So you have a lot of sedimentary layers that were deposited over the last 260 million years as the tectonic plates drifted back and forth. Ultimately, as the tectonic plates rose through what's known as an orogeny or a mountain building event, the waters drained away, and due to the current latitude of the Colorado Plateau, it is a vast desert system. So generally the Colorado Plateau gets less than 7 inches of rain a year. Again, that's where I'm at right now, and we are having a lot less than 7 inches this year. It's a pretty big drought that's taking place throughout the Southwest, and Utah is hurting. It gets the name the Colorado Plateau because we do have some major river systems that cut through, kind of like a knife, through this large upraised rock, you could say. The Colorado River itself comes out of the Rocky Mountains. You also have the Green River, which comes out of the Wind River Range up in Wyoming and the Yellowstone ecosystem, and they converge together in Canyons National Park. They're central to this map, and then they flow southward through the Grand Canyon. So it's a dry area, but there are some major rivers that incise this large piece of geography. And because these rivers are originating in high mountains, they generally flow a long distance and cut very deep into the rocks. Here's an aerial view of some of our magnificent landscapes that we have here. Again, sedimentary rock being cut apart by rivers, especially the rivers that flow fast after snow melt in the early to late spring. The humans who lived on this landscape, they adapted to the climate. We had, specifically in the area that I'm working on, the Colorado Plateau, we had the Paiute and Ute Native American tribes. We also had the Navajo Nation, we had the Hopi, we had the Goshute in some areas, and we had bands of the Shoshone tribe as well that lived specifically in this Utah region. But they adapted to the hot and the dry climate and utilized the resources that were here and were available to them. Now, in the early 1800s in the United States, the fur trade caught fever, and a lot of folks, mountain men as we call them, wanted to come out into the great unknown and get rich fast. The fur trade has been prevalent across all of the world, but it really gained a lot of popularity in North America soon after European settlement, especially up in Canada, where in the 1600s you had the Hudson Bay Trade Company, which established trade routes and trapping routes with indigenous peoples, as well as with white explorers and settlers, again, who wanted to get rich by trapping animals and selling their pelts back east, either in Europe or in America. But in the United States proper, in the contiguous United States, the trapping industry really didn't pick up until the 1820s, when you had great mountain men like Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, and of course Jedediah Smith, who I'll talk about in just a minute, who really kind of pushed their limits into what was recently purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. To utilize what resources we had here for financial and economic gain. Beaver really became popular as a fur trapping commodity due to a fashionable statement in Eastern society, in Europe and in the Eastern United States, where people began to compress and make these beaver felt hats. Beaver felt is extremely fine. To put it into perspective, if you were to take a 1 by 1 inch square of beaver fur and count all the hairs in that 1 by 1 inch square, that would approximate all of the hairs that most humans have on their head. So that just goes to show just how dense their fur is, how rich it is. And people would shave off the guard hairs, and you compress the under fur, the down, and you can make felt hats out of it. And because this was so popular, beaver got you a lot of money. And so trappers who wanted, again, to get rich quick came out here to trap beavers as fast as they could. And there was very little understanding of ecology and of harvest regulations and the impacts that could be caused on beaver populations, or other populations for that matter. And so trappers quickly and aggressively trapped most of their beaver haunts out. So they would move to one area and then they'd trap it out till there were no more beaver, and then they'd just move on to the next area. And in doing so, they extirpated most of North America's beavers. I will take a minute just to insert a fact that beavers, as a population, they have rebounded across North America, and they do exhibit a range that is similar to Euro-American settlement, although their numbers are not nearly as much as they were. We probably have about an estimated 15 million beavers, 15, that's 15 million beavers in North America compared to the 300 or the 400 million beavers that we had previously. However, their range is pretty much the same. There's just a lot less habitat, and so it's unlikely that their numbers will ever get back as high as they once were. Really quickly, I'll introduce to you Jedediah Strong Smith, who was a famous trapper. He was a cartographer as well, survived a grizzly bear mauling. And the reason why he's important to this story is because he was more interested in exploration than he was in trapping. Although he knew what buttered his bread, he decided to leave the northern Rocky Mountains as a fur trader and explore the Southwest, specifically along the Colorado Plateau, to try and find a route to California, which he succeeded in doing. But along the way, as he made it through the Escalante, along the Colorado River and the Green River, he basically found areas where there were beaver to trap. And those who followed him decided to stay often in locations and trap for beaver. And in doing so, they extirpated the beaver populations that were on the Colorado Plateau, which were never numerous to begin with. And so it was pretty quick that they removed them. Next in our rapid chronological story of the Colorado Plateau, we have Mormon Settlement in 1847, which took place out here. They were the first permanent Euro-American settlers to live on this landscape. And they obviously were living off the land in ways that were different than the indigenous peoples that were here. They were not hunters and gatherers like the Utes and the Paiutes. Rather, they based their economy on agriculture. And so they needed to have water in order to fuel their crops and to fuel their livestock as well. John Wesley Powell was a famous explorer in the 1860s and 70s who came out to the west and essentially mapped the last uncharted territory in the contiguous United States. And in doing so, he said, this country is barren, it's arid. This is a few decades after Manifest Destiny had really taken off, but basically he went back to the United States government after his expeditions down the Colorado River, and he told the United States that the Southwest, the Colorado Plateau, would not be a great place to grow crops or to ranch livestock, just because water means everything, and there's not a lot of water out there. Nevertheless, the government didn't really listen. It's kind of hard to squelch these idealized dreams of owning land and making a living off of the land. And so people continued to come out west. And as they continued to come, they brought with them their ways of life. And that primarily included ranching. So this is taken not far from where I am right now, but you can see that there's not a lot to eat out there if you're a black Angus cow. Nevertheless, people made it work, and they began to divert rivers, and they diverted creeks. They enforced irrigation to make their needs be met. But at this time, there was a poor understanding of range land management. And for lack of an understanding of the ecology and the environment, people let their cattle graze. And of course, those cattle aren't that dumb. They know that they want to be where there's green food to eat, and that green food is generally where there's also water. And so cattle, even to this day, when there's poor rangeland management, they congregate in habitat, which is most vital to the ecosystem at large. And in doing so, they trample and they overbrowse and they overgraze on the vegetation that is so important to wildlife and to the biodiversity on the landscape. And they turn rivers essentially into mucky mud holes. This was an unfortunate consequence of, again, a lack of understanding during the latter half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, when people didn't have a science for rangeland management. Fortunately, today, we have agencies and we have educative programs that help teach people that we need to live more sustainably on the landscape. Nevertheless, without beavers, suddenly having all of these domestic animals, your cattle and your sheep, you are damaging the landscape, and we're seeing more and more negative impacts as the decades move along. We also have out west wild horse problems. The Wild Horse and Burros Protection Act of the 1970s, 1971 to be exact, is an interesting story, and it's not something that I'm necessarily going to go into here in this presentation. Maybe I'll have to give a presentation on it at a different date. But we have a problem with wild horses out in the western deserts. The fact is that there is a lot of desert and you have a lot of horses, which although historically we had horses in North America during the Pleistocene, we also had a lot of other large carnivores that preyed upon them. Today, especially in the Southwest, we don't have any large predators that regularly prey upon horses. And so the horse population gets larger and larger. And also I'd like to point out that historically, our native horses, again during the Ice Age, they roamed across the prairies. And even after the Spanish reintroduced the horse in the 1500s, and we had as many as 2 million horses across North America, ranging wild and free, most of those horses were living in the grasslands where they could live comfortably. But now most of those grasslands have been developed and they're turned into farms. And so today, the wild horses that we do have are persistent in the deserts. And like the cattle, they can abuse the habitat that is necessary to support biodiversity for a whole bunch of other organisms. So we get problems like this, where we have lots of hooves chewing up the soft, muddy ground, not a lot of vegetation left behind, and it's very damaging to the environment as a whole. Without regular water systems, without anything to retain the water, you get arroyos or these desert washes. And of course, we have climate change as well. This is taken from a news broadcast out here in Utah just a little while ago. It shows you over the last 20 years, essentially, the drought conditions that we have been experiencing in Utah. Right now, Utah has been declared to be in a state of emergency because of how severe the droughts are. Where I'm at, people are being concerned about having enough drinking water as the season progresses. This is not just going to impact human recreation and human sustainable living. It's also impacting our wildlife because there's not a lot of green forage for animals to eat. This is something, again, that's extremely alarming, and we're very concerned about it right now. But it is a miserably hot year. Our governor just declared yesterday that he just asked yesterday in a public announcement that people pray for rain. So that was a long roundabout way to get back to beavers. I hope you stayed with me. I know you signed up for this presentation because you're interested in beavers. Nevertheless, I felt like it was important to give you the whole story, all of the context, in order to to make the importance of beavers that much more poignant as our champion or our hero in this story. So to summarize, we once had beavers throughout the Colorado Plateau, just as we had beavers across all of North America, but they were extirpated from a lot of their range. And although beavers are coming back, they still are perhaps underappreciated in many areas. And our goal or our object is to try and help beavers recolonize areas where their historic range might have been, as well as to help heal the environment. And the best tool that we have is, of course, the tools that nature has already given us. And in this case, it's the beaver. So one of our projects is to work by capturing nuisance beavers, beavers that are problems in urban areas, and rather than euthanizing them, we try to move them, their whole colony if possible, and relocate them to desert environments where they can live out of the way from getting into problems with people, damming up roads or cutting down people's apple trees or cherry trees, etc. Instead, we bring them to the desert where they have relatively suitable habitat. But the goal is to help, again, heal the land and heal the environment. So we capture these beavers and we take measurements from them. We make sure that they're healthy and that they're well. And in doing this, we are trying to ensure that there is a high survivability rate of all beaver colonies that are reestablished across the Colorado Plateau. Again, we check their measurements. We insert a transmitter onto their tail. We secure it, often with epoxy. Sometimes that doesn't work and the transmitters pop off, but nevertheless, they let us know where these beavers are at and where they're recolonizing. We also test the animals for parasites. We look for aquatic invasive species that might be in the animal's fur or on their skin, and we quarantine them for 3 days before they're released to their new site, because the last thing we want to do is move a bunch of aquatic invasive species around from one body of water to another. And then we take them on site to release them into what is the most suitable habitat. And in this region of Utah, we're releasing them into the Price River and into the San Juan River. We let them go. There's yours truly carrying one of these handsome beavers. We let them go in desert habitat, again, where beavers historically ranged, and they are able to make a living off of the willows that are in the area, Russian olives, which are not native, and tamarisk, which is also not native. They're able to utilize these resources, and ultimately, as we document their movements, we try to ensure that they maintain a viable population and turn habitat like this into this. Again, the wonderful thing about beavers is that their dams are, you could say, temporary. They allow a lot of flow, overflow, and underflow, which retains sediment and it retards the water from going downstream too quickly. And in doing so, it basically greens up everything above the dam system. Now, here in the Southwest, we have what are known as flash floods. These are violent floods that take place in high elevated areas where there might be a rainstorm or a thunderstorm. The water coalesces and rushes downstream and causes a lot of damage. When these happen, they might blow out beaver dams one after the other, but when you have successive beaver dams all in a row, say a mile or 2 miles downstream, these beaver dams actually act as speed bumps. And it might blow out 1 dam or 2 dams, maybe even 3, but by the 4th dam, it generally has stopped, which is fantastic. And then the beavers get back at it, and they do what beavers do best, and they rebuild their dams. Again, this helps the soil to retain what is being lost, that rich topsoil, which is needed for plants, as well as the water, which is also needed for plants and wildlife. So these beavers are doing a fantastic job of slowly and steadily making the environment better as well as they can, which is pretty exciting for us. However, some areas have been so abused due to poor rangeland management that we can't bring beavers back yet. because there isn't sufficient food for the beavers to eat. There's been, systemic problems with rangeland management, and cattle have overeaten their share of any incoming willows or cottonwood trees or even tamarisk in some places. And so there's nothing there for the beavers to subsist on. So we want to improve the landscape ourselves. We made the mess as humans, and so it's our responsibility to go in and to basically start being beavers in order to create habitat for beavers. This is an example of a beaver dam analog, or a BDA as we call them. These are artificial beaver dams that we drive in to rivers. On this particular stretch of river known as Miller Creek, we put in, I think, about 22 different beaver dam analogs within a 5-mile stretch of river. There are cedar posts that are pounded into the ground, and then we weave juniper boughs and dirt and twigs to basically make a simulated beaver dam, which then retards, again, the water and the sediment from flowing downstream, and ultimately will create this radiation effect where vegetation and water begin to spill out to the sides of what is otherwise just a channel, and this water begins to facilitate the growth of plants that other wildlife can come and enjoy. And as the plants continue to grow, as the habitat improves, we are able to reintroduce beavers. And to speed things up, we also come in and we build these beaver dam analogs, and then we go and we plant willows and we plant native flora to try and accelerate beaver habitat. Again, this is a long process. Unfortunately, it's what we have to do when, after decades of degradation, our stream habitats or riparian areas have nothing left as far as food and resource goes for species, for wildlife. And so we come in and we build these beaver dam analogs, and we start to plant vegetation. And it takes 5 to 10 years before we see enough of a habitat improvement for us to reintroduce beavers. But it's exciting for us to be reintroducing beavers and to be improving the habitat of these desert areas, because not only, of course, does it accelerate the green up of vegetation, but it also provides habitat for fish. This is a trout species that we've caught. That's what we're doing back here, is we're doing electroshocking to survey fish that have recolonized a stream after beavers were reintroduced 4 or 5 years ago. And we're finding more and more fish living in this habitat. It's really exciting. This is a trout, which is not native to this particular stream. I wish I had a picture of some of the native and sometimes even endangered species of fish that we're finding as well. Round-tailed chub, pike minnows, even razorback suckers in some areas. But it's really fascinating and cool to see just how much of an impact these beavers can make on the landscape. We're seeing deer come back. We're seeing songbirds, of course. It's pretty thrilling to see these desert areas that have been neglected and abused and degraded for so many years start to flourish again. Now, one of the problems that persists today about humans coexisting with beavers is that beavers do tend to cause problems. We have nuisance beaver problems. That is why beavers still are not welcome in a lot of human habitated areas. Beavers will clog up culverts, they'll block storm drains, they'll block irrigation canals. When their dams break, they can knock out roads. They cut down trees that we deem important to our backyards or to our neighborhoods. So if we are going to live with beavers, and if beavers are the solution to restoring quality habitat to desert landscapes, we also have to be proactive in deterring any potential negative beaver damage that might be caused in human habitated areas. So this right here is known as a Beaver Deceiver. Basically, it's a metal fencing that is blocking off a culvert. So beavers might be out in the stream and they would have the urge to come and block up this culvert to dam it up, which would cause a lot of property damage. We don't want that to happen, so we're being proactive, and before we release the beavers, we come in and we put in these beaver deceivers. Again, fencing that helps to prevent beavers from damming the culverts. And that's the cost of, again, trying to improve the landscape, is we have to not just sit back and let things take their course, but sometimes we have to get our hands dirty and we have to work hard to try and restore the riparian areas that are necessary for providing life to desert ecosystems. And it's incredible to see what has been working over the last 10, 15 years. We have a lot of willows coming back, and we have a lot of cottonwoods growing, and we have a lot of, again, native species of fish and birds and even large animals like mule deer and elk benefiting from these beavers. And it's particularly exciting to me when I'm out in the field to be hiking in these canyons and to come across beaver sign, beaver dam, a beaver lodge, signs where beavers have been recently chewing on trees. It's, again, a paradox because we so often think of these animals as being in mountains, forests, areas where there's a lot of water. And it's so thrilling to me to see that there are beavers who are persistent enough to try and make a living in what is seemingly unsuitable habitat. And so I get excited every time I see these wonderful animals. Ultimately, the goal is to try and, again, see greening taking place, radiating out from the streams. We don't want these fast flowing channels that incise the landscape, that cut across the landscape. We want to see water being retained and helping to diversify and beautify the landscape and make it more prosperous and fertile for humans and for wildlife. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. Water is essential for life, and we need as much of it as we can get. And so having these incredible mammals, these incredible rodents at our back is a fascinating opportunity to just sit back and watch them work and see the transformation that takes place on the landscape. So in closing, I'll just say that beavers are fantastic animals, and they really are unique engineers of the environment, of the ecosystem. It's satisfying to see them in places where you wouldn't expect them. They can be challenging to live with, just like all wildlife can be challenging to live with. But if we really want to make a difference in a world that is experiencing climate change, I think we need to turn more to nature to see how nature can perhaps instruct us how to best preserve and conserve what we do have before we lose it all. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation on desert beavers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. Now it's time for questions. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone that you can type in your questions via the questions field in your GoToWebinar control panel. All right, we have quite a few questions here. We'll take as many as we can while we have time with Aaron here. There were a few questions about kind of beavers specifically, including what is a beaver's life expectancy?
Good question. Beavers, even though they're rodents, they can live for a pretty long time. They generally reach sexual maturity between 1.5 to 2 years of age, and they reach their peak in growth usually 4 to 5 years. And generally, we start to see them decline in reproductive senescence around 9 years of age. So they can live over 10 years of age. They are attractive to a lot of predators, as I mentioned: coyotes, bears, otters, wolves, mountain lions. These animals, if you can catch them out of water, are delicious and they don't put up much of a fight. And so because they're so attractive to predators, generally their life expectancy is typically around 5 years, but they can live over 10 years.
Thank you. That's actually a great segue into a few other questions. We're asking about the river otters that prey on beavers and the wolves in areas with higher wolf populations like Yellowstone. How do beaver colonies survive when with so many predators picking them off?
Good question. Beavers have high fecundity, which to understand what fecundity is, it's not just high reproductive success, but it's also seeing success in rearing your offspring until they reach sexual maturity themselves. So because beavers take such good care of their kits, of their offspring, even though there is substantial predation on the landscape where beavers get picked off by these predators, the recruitment is pretty high, which fortunately for us is why beavers were able to naturally rebound from almost extinction at the end of the 1800s to a very sustainable population, again, of probably 15 million beavers in North America today. So it's not as high as it was, but without human help, they definitely are able to rebound as a species just because of their fertility and their fecundity.
Great, thanks. So a few other questions were about the transponders that researchers are placing on the beaver's tail. Do the beavers try to get the transponders off their tails, and does the transponder interfere with the use of their tail, like for swimming or giving warnings?
Good question. So as far as we know, we've never documented a beaver trying to take the transmitter off of the tail. It's kind of like an earring that you get put in the tail. The tail is just a rich, fatty organ at the end of the body that can act as a fat reserve in times of dearth or times of famine. But generally, the beaver uses its tail for swimming capabilities. I think we're pretty familiar with beavers also slapping the top of the water to communicate to other beavers in the area of maybe water depth, as well as predators in the area. There's some speculation as to why beavers slap the top of the water with their tails. We haven't seen any behavioral altercations or changes due to transmitters being put on the tail. However, sometimes the transmitters do get caught up in twigs or in roots or something, and they pop off pretty easily. So it doesn't do any harm to the beaver, but that is one of the challenges as researchers is having the transmitters not fall off, because they do fall off pretty easily when the beavers are roughhousing out there in the wild.
Makes sense. Just for reference, could you explain how large a beaver's tail is?
Yeah, beaver tails grow differently on different individuals. I was just trying to think if I had a good picture, but I think I deleted it, unfortunately. It depends on the sex, it depends on the age of the animal, and it also just depends on the individual animal. So generally, a beaver's tail is about a third of its body length. The thickness of the tail can, if it's a healthy beaver, if it's a fat beaver, it can be almost a half an inch in thickness, but oftentimes it's a lot thinner than that, about probably a quarter of an inch thick. But really, again, they kind of vary in shape and in size. It's common to see large chunks taken out of their tail, just again from living a rough life. They get torn up and ripped in roots, and kind of like I don't know, again, like an earlobe, I guess is the best way I could describe it. And if you're out in the brush and you've got an earlobe that's a third the size of your body, it's gonna get punctured and ripped a little bit.
Cool. So another few questions are related to when beavers that are becoming problems in urban areas are relocated. You'd mentioned they were monogamous. What, if anything, do scientists and researchers do to try and ensure that they're not splitting off a beaver that's being relocated from its offspring or its partner?
Good question. Fortunately, beavers don't disperse very far. So if you have a beaver in a neighborhood that's causing a problem, it's safe to say that you could trap it live, and you can continue to set traps to see if you can catch the rest of the family. Also, beavers are generally very conspicuous. They're easy to spot if you know when to look. They're crepuscular, so in the evenings or in the mornings, you can generally spot them. It's easy to see their dams. It's easy to see their lodges. And so by monitoring the beaver habitat for a week or 2 weeks, you can get a good feel of whether or not you've caught the whole colony. Beavers also, I should have mentioned this earlier, but they don't always live in lodges. They often den in the sides of banks. They're really good diggers, and so nevertheless, they always will try and build those dams to maintain good habitat. And so if we catch one beaver, we usually spend the next 2 weeks trying to catch any other beavers in the vicinity, and we monitor the area very closely.
Great, thank you. I think you may have touched on this earlier, but we do have a question. Which NatHab trip would one be able to see the most desert beavers on?
The most desert beavers would probably be, as far as I know, would be the Canyons trip. You can see beavers anywhere really along that trip. When you're in Zion National Park, they have a population of beavers along the Virgin River. So that would be a great place to look for them. You can often see at least their dams and their lodges in Zion National Park. But that Canyons trip runs from Bryce Canyon all the way down to the Grand Canyon, and you're driving through a lot of beaver habitat. So anywhere that you stop along the way, you might be able to see a beaver if you express interest to your guide.
Great, thanks. Another question, can people volunteer to help in some of the beaver restoration and reintroduction projects that are underway?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, we mostly deal with volunteers. It depends on your neighborhood or your state. You have to find out who is involved the most in beaver restoration. So beaver are considered a species of native wildlife, so they're going to be protected in your state by your state fish and game agency. So in Utah, it's called the Utah Division of Wildlife. In Idaho, it's Idaho Fish and Game. In Montana, it's Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. In California, I think it's California Fish and Wildlife or something like that. So every state has a wildlife agency responsible for protecting and managing all wildlife in that state. So that would probably be the best place to start looking. You can get on their website, whatever state you're in, get on their website and find out who is working with beavers, what projects are currently ongoing with beaver habitat restoration. And oftentimes the state agencies will collaborate with non-government organizations or wildlife rehabilitation centers in order to see the projects through. So generally it's multiple groups working together. But yes, we love volunteers.
Great, thank you. And because you provided such a comprehensive presentation on the history and different aspects of all this, there was a number of people who were interested in some of the other topics you touched on. So this isn't a question, but there are several people who are very interested to potentially learn more in the future about wild horses. So figured I'd bring that to your attention. And yeah, that's unfortunately, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'll hand it back to you, Aaron, for any closing comments.
Well, thanks. And yeah, I have to deal with wild horses a bit in my work, so maybe I'll do a presentation on that. Thank you, everyone. I really, again, enjoyed this subject. It's unfortunate that I always have to talk to myself looking at a computer screen and I can't interact with all of you. I'd much rather do that. But I appreciate you tuning in today. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you can have a more in-depth appreciation for these incredible rodents here in North America. Again, whoever asked about volunteering for projects like this, I encourage you to get involved. You can contact your state wildlife agency, and at the very least, they should be able to put you in touch with who's working with beavers or other wildlife where. I work as a wildlife biologist throughout the Northern Rockies and in the Intermountain West. So I deal with everything, again, from grizzlies to bison to beavers. And although it's incredible to live where I live, I always like to tell people that wildlife in your own backyards, whether you're in Connecticut or Georgia or Florida or Oregon, the wildlife in your backyard is spectacular, and it needs conservation and protection too. So get locally involved, and thank you everyone for staying tuned today.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to present for us, Aaron. We're getting a lot of positive feedback on your presentation and the lessons people learned from our hundreds of attendees today. And thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature, A Year in the Life of a Polar Bear, presented by Expedition Leader Eleanor Eady. You can also visit our website at nathab.com/webinars for the upcoming webinar schedule, and keep an eye out for our weekly email on Sunday. We also recorded today's presentation and will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude this webinar. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great weekend.